Hello, I'm Nick Reynolds, and I'm just continuing the previous 6 jazz skills videos, and this one I just want to look quickly at the idea of licks in jazz and how to employ them. I'm going to be going straight over the first 8 bars of Autumn Leaves, as I've been doing in every single other video, just because it's a nice sort of example of a chord sequence that turns up a lot in jazz, as you probably all know very well. We're just going to be playing 2-5-1 in B flat, then we've got the 4 chord, then we've got a minor 2-5-1 in G minor, and then we finish with a altered chord. And so far I've looked at things like common tones, constant scale exercises, modal sort of like interchange, various ideas like that. But what we haven't done is taken very, very specific phrases. So really a lick is a kind of premeditated phrase that you practice, that you borrow off or sort of appropriate from particular jazz musicians that you really like. For example, someone like Bill Evans, who does a lot of lines that are very, very consistent, that he's clearly kind of worked out in a certain way. How he juxtaposes them, you know, in a solo is the incredibly impressive thing, but he uses certain devices quite regularly, and you could easily take a phrase from Bill Evans and then learn how to use it in every single key. So the lick that we're going to be using is just going to go up, first of all, C minor triad. Okay, there's a C minor triad, and then I'm going to go up to a B flat major triad. So that's just... then I'm going to come down a bebop mixolydian over the F7th. Now, as I hit the 13th of that chord, that's where the F7th chord will come in. Okay, and when I get to that 3rd, so I've just gone down a F bebop mixolydian, and as I hit the 3rd of that, I'm then going to go into the altered scale to give it a bit of spice. Okay, with the sharp 9, flat 9, the root note, flattened 7th, which lands me on the 3rd of B flat major. Now, this is a nice lick. It's a fairly generic one, to be honest. You could probably find it in people like Oscar Peterson, Charlie Parker, so on and so forth. So it's nothing particularly special. It's just an example. Sounds like that. And I could sort of stay silent on that point, give it a bit of space, or do a kind of little flourish or whatever at the end of it. But basically that's the riff. Over the minor 2-5-1, we're going to do pretty much the same riff, but obviously I've just got to adapt it for the minor chord that we're using here. So now I'm going to play an A half diminished. Okay, then I'm going to go up to a G major triad, which gives me a 7th and a kind of 9th and an 11th. So that's a really nice upper structure. Okay, so it's... I'm going to do exactly the same as I did before, which is go down a bebop mixolydian over the D7th, and as I hit the 13th, okay, that would be where the D7th comes in, and I will finish on the 3rd of that D7th. Then I'm going to hit the altered scale again for a bit of spice, which is the sharp 9, flat 9, root note, 7th, and of course here I've got to land on a minor 3rd for the G minor. So that sounds like... Okay, and again I could put in a little kind of response line on those last 2 bars each time, since I've got a bit of space. And that's an idea of a lick, okay? And it's very specific. What we could do then, if anyone's practiced, you know, like licks and riffs and so on and so forth, is to then go round, I think, the cycle of fifths. So if it's a really good lick that you would like to get into your vocabulary, then you just want to then write the cycle of fifths. And then we could do, for example, so the first key that we would be playing that riff in would be, for example, C major. And then I would be going into the key of G major on the next one, so I do a 2-5-1 in G major, do the same thing. Up. So basically, and then I'd work around the cycle of fifths, make sure I could do it at a particular tempo, so something like 60 BPM, doo-ba-doo-ba-doo, or whatever. And if I can do that consistently, I know I've kind of got it under my muscle memory. Now, the big question then really is, what are you supposed to do with it? Is that like, are you supposed to now every single time, you know, you see a 2-5-1 and you want to put that riff in, is it supposed to be exactly the same thing each time? So this is the context I want to provide really. Just to quickly remind you, if you haven't watched any of my other videos, I am actually recording a comprehensive course, literally going from, you know, chord tones all the way through to kind of advanced riffs and licks with PDFs and a much more detailed sort of explanation. So this is more of a kind of taster really. But anyway, what do we do with these riffs and licks? Well, first of all, I think it is actually useful. If you took that in the context then of other jazz pieces that use 2-5-1, so something like All the Things You Are or Stella by Starlight, you can then start incorporating that lick quite directly, exactly as you've learnt it, into the actual arrangement initially. So you sort of learn it by rote and then start putting it into context as you see a 2-5-1. So for example, in All the Things You Are, the progression is, you know, like a 6 chord first of all, but then you go straight into a 2-5-1 in A flat. So there. So as we hit that kind of 2-5-1, we can then put that that little lick in. Why would you want to do that? Well, the answer is really that licks that are learnt from really great jazz musicians, whoever they are teaching you the way that these chord tones and colour tones and chromatic passing notes actually work, almost in the form of a sentence. So it's allowing you to see how things actually work in a kind of flow as a long sentence. Once you've understood, I think, the principle and you've learnt a few licks that actually work really well over particular chord progressions that come up a lot in jazz, then you can start, then you start moving away from it to an extent, but it will have taught you how to fit these phrases in. But the other thing which is really cool is this, that is when you've actually learnt a riff like this, you can break it down and actually then start pulling it apart and improvising with it. So the first part of that riff I gave you, is a C minor thing, which at least shows you, we know we can always play a major or a minor triad against the appropriate chord. So that's the first thing, is that the first part of that riff just shows you that you've got a kind of minor triad against a minor chord. But of course I can also put in a chromatic passing now. So I can start using that kind of minor triad at least as a sort of launching pad. But another part of this, which I think is quite interesting, is the B flat major, which gives us a kind of interesting upper structure over a minor 7th chord. Here we've got, again, we've got a 7th, 9th, and an 11th, so I can start using that part of the riff and actually now trying things out with it. So it's not like you're stuck, syntactically with it exactly the way it's actually laid out. You can start breaking the riff down and actually working out certain elements of it that work for you. So if we look at the next bit of the riff, we also start learning our bebop mixolydians. So here again, I could use that isolated if there was just a 5 chord to a 1 chord, and so on and so forth. So I can use the bebop mixolydian again sort of individually. I can also, of course, I'll show you in a second, sort of like play around with the rhythm of these particular riffs as well. Another thing this riff shows you straight away, if you've learnt it, in all of the different keys, is a really good use of the altered scale over a 5-to-1 progression, because the altered scale again is a kind of odd sounding scale if you don't completely understand how it works. If I just start playing around with the altered, it's a strange scale, but if I'm just doing something like that, I'm getting to a real good understanding of how those sharp 9s and flat 9s then resolve back onto the 1 chord. And that means, every single time I see that, I can start using it in every single key, and actually I've got a really good idea of those particular notes and their relation to a 5-1 progression. The final part of it, of that riff, is that I have actually left it blank, as in, I would say, one of the big elements of jazz and jazz phrasing and how to learn how to do it is the call and response. So once we've got that kind of riff, bit of that riff fragmented. Put it into a kind of triplet form. So the idea really with a riff or a lick or whatever is basically learn it exactly as it's done, learn it in every single key, put it into context of different songs. This one, for example, that riff works over a 2-5-1 sequence where you have got a bar of each of those things. But if I've only got one bar where I've got a 2-5 in it, 2 beat, 2 beat, 1, then I need obviously a different kind of riff. Something more like that, for example. Then I could learn a kind of 2-bar, 2-5-1 progression also. So that's really sort of what we're aiming to do, is learn it in every single sort of key, learn it absolutely almost mathematically, learn to apply it into the context of particular standards so you understand where it falls in. Start breaking it down, so you start looking at the riff in kind of almost an individual way, bits of it, and how they are working, and then start sort of playing around with that riff. You know, you can put it in reverse, there's all sorts of... You know, you don't have to do it exactly as it's done, but it shows you a way that the language kind of works, and then allows you to start breaking it apart and then constructing it into your own particular style. Just as a final sort of caveat to this, when I was much younger, in my 20s, and I'm like 51 now, I started learning the riff kind of thing, and I got absolutely riffs or licks. I got obsessed with it, and I had like a notebook of like, you know, 10 different riffs over this chord and 10 different riffs over that, and other riffs over these progressions, and I had an absolute mountain of like riffs I was supposed to learn in every single key, and I thought that would be a really good way to sort of learn to improvise. I think personally now, if I was starting again, I would not do that. I would just learn a couple of ones that work over particular progressions. Certain, you know, like ideas that perhaps go over one chord. There's that Herbie Hancock sort of, you know, oh dear, sorry, that kind of idea. He sort of does. So, like, if you learnt that, you know, one of those kind of like sort of riffs over particular kind of chords, you know, it gives you a little bit of kind of language over the chord rather than just sort of like trying things out. But what you don't want to do is get completely bogged down with an endless succession of them. You just want a certain number just to teach you a bit more about how the vocabulary itself works. So hopefully that was helpful, gives you a bit of context. And like I say, if you're interested, the course will be coming out hopefully in sort of like September, and that will give you PDFs in all the sort of different keys as well, and a lot more detailed breakdown of these kind of various ideas. All right, thank you.